Hey guys, welcome back to the studio for another lesson. This week I'm going to be sharing some of my personal practice routine with you to help you better focus in on crafting your own. My approach to developing a practice routine is a little deeper than I feel comfortable fitting into one video, so in today's installment we're just going to be focusing on the things that I practice to keep my technical chops in shape. This includes, but isn't always limited to, things like articulation, scale shapes, arpeggio shapes, sweep picking, and a whole lot more. We've got some work to do today, so let's get started. When thinking about how to construct your routine, it's important to keep in mind what your musical goals are. Obviously, there are certain things that are more or less maintenance for us to practice, but we should really be making our routine work towards advancing us in the direction that we want to go. For my particular playing style, I have a few things that I always focus on. First is playing scale-based lines with a saxophone-style articulation, and second is playing arpeggios with a combination of sweeping and alternate picking. Even with just those two things on my mind, there's a lot that I can do in my technical routine to get more comfortable playing with the types of lines that I want to play, with the sounds that I want to hear. When it comes to playing scales with a saxophone-style articulation, we can't exactly replicate what they do, simply because the mechanics of our instruments are so different. But we can get close by combining plucked and slurred notes when playing through scales. In this first exercise, we'll play through a G major scale from each of the chord tones of a G major 7, using economy picking on the way up. On the way down, we'll use Barry Harris's half-step rules and play a slur into the last note on each string. Here's how that sounds. This works really great for getting started with trying to emulate the sound of a saxophone doing jazz articulation, but it isn't the only way to get that sound. I also like to practice trying to put slurs on the last note of every string when I'm going in both directions. I find this works really well for positional scales on the guitar, so let me show you how I practice this when we do it starting from every note of a G major scale. Just like before, we'll ascend to each scale using only diatonic notes, but on the way down, we'll use one of Barry Harris's rules for descending scale lines. Here's how that sounds. There's a ton of mileage in this kind of practice, especially if you allow it to be driven not by speed or efficiency, but instead by articulation and musicality. In the PDF for today's lesson, I've included a whole bunch of other technical exercises I like to use for practicing these different kinds of articulations. For now, I want to show you one more that I think is super beneficial to working out this aspect of your technique. It's also a great workout for your left-hand slurs. In this exercise, we're going to use the Segovia scale fingering for G major and play neighbor tone triplets using slurs. Since we can't actually do a real slur when we cross strings, we're going to have to work on our right hand technique to simulate the sound of a slur when we do that string cross. On the way up the scale, we'll do a triplet to the lower diatonic neighbor tone, while on the way down, we'll use the upper neighbor. Here's how that sounds now. Like I said, the combination of economy or efficiency picking and slurs is a critical aspect of my approach to playing jazz on the guitar. There is another element that I spend an equal amount of time practicing so I can better emulate the sounds that you'll typically hear out of saxophone players. Now, specifically, I'm talking about sweep picking. Up next, I'm going to show you a few exercises from the PDF for today's lesson that I use or have used to work on my sweep picking. Before we do that, though, I need to take a quick break and give a shout out to TrueFire.com for supporting the channel. TrueFire is an online lesson library that's host to literally thousands of courses on a wide range of musical topics from some really amazing artists and educators, including yours truly. If you're interested in improving your comping, make sure to check out my course, Exploring Melodic Jazz Comping, available on TrueFire now. In this course, I'll demonstrate and break down 17 essential comping approaches using TrueFire's interactive learning tools. We'll work on a colorful variety of melodic and harmonic approaches using drop two voicings, chord substitutions, approach chords, diminished concepts, and voice leading. We'll also dive into triadic approaches, partial chords, using scales as chords, and the art of borrowing notes and dominants. You'll learn how these melodic comping approaches can be artistically applied using backing tracks based on the changes to popular jazz standards, like Autumn Leaves, There Will Never Be Another You, and All the Things You Are. The link to the course is in the description of this video. Now let's get back to the lesson, and I'll show you some great exercises that'll help you develop your sweep picking technique. Sweep picking is a huge part of my technical approach to playing bebop lines on the guitar, so I've spent a ton of time over the years developing the technique itself and thinking about ways to apply it to get the sounds that I want. Just like when we were talking about scale-based lines, I do this to simulate the sound that a saxophone gets when they're using jazz articulation on their instrument. We're going to do a few exercises in this section that use varying degrees of sweep picking for different purposes, so we should first spend some time on an exercise that's purely about the technique and nothing else. Now, I first learned this exercise from Adam Rogers when he came to my university to give a master class, and it's been a staple of my technical practice ever since. The idea here is to construct a chord as a stack of fifths and fourths, playing one note on every string. We'll then sweep up and down that chord as a sextuplet and then move that shape through the entire key we're in. Since we've been playing in G major up until now, we'll do the exercise in that key as well. Here's what it sounds like. Even with just this exercise, there's a lot you can learn about sweeping technique. Just getting this to feel clean and playing all the notes evenly is challenging enough, but we can always try and squeeze a little bit more out of it by altering the shape of the chord or changing the direction that we start with. We could even do things like go up one position and down the next, or play the positions in thirds, or even play with different accents to practice having total control of our sweeping technique. Once we've got a decent grasp on that technique, though, we should try putting it to work in a context that's a little bit more musically related to what we're trying to achieve in our practice. Here's a simple exercise for you to work out with your sweeping technique. We're going to play all the chords in G major, moving up the neck while staying on the top four strings the entire time. Then we'll do the same thing in reverse. Keep a close ear on the articulation I'm giving to each note. Even though I'm plucking most or all of them in the sweep, I'm using varying degrees of strength in my pick attack to give a slight accent to certain parts of the beat to make things swing a little harder. Take a listen to how that sounds now. Like I said, it's a pretty simple exercise. However, if you really take the time to work on controlling your sweeping technique so you can play the accents like I did in that example, you'll find that your lines and your sense of bebop eighth notes are going to end up being much closer to what you hear coming from saxophone players. Now, that being said, we shouldn't only practice this way on the top four strings. When I practice this over the whole range of the instrument, I usually like to go up one arpeggio and then down the next, all while trying to keep the articulation consistent despite the changing fingering patterns. Then on the reverse, I'll do the same thing, but backwards. In other words, we'll go down one chord and up the next until we find ourselves back where we started. Here's how that sounds now. Before we wrap things up for today, I want to share one more technical exercise that I consistently do. Remember, the stuff I share with you here on YouTube is just a small portion of the entire PDF resource that you can grab over at my Patreon page. For each of these videos, I always try to put together a ton of material and different variations to keep you guys busy in between uploads. So today's last exercise is one that I think is super useful for keeping your chops together when playing bebop. And you've definitely heard it before if you've ever watched any of the videos of Barry Harris's famous masterclasses here on YouTube. We're going to play up each chord in the key of G and then resolve down a step. Then we'll do the same chord again, but with a pivot instead. We'll do this through the entire register while trying to keep the articulation consistent throughout. Here's how that sounds now. Thanks so much for sticking around all the way to the end of today's video. Let me know down in the comments what you guys thought of the lesson. It's definitely important to have some level of maintenance on your technical chops, but it's equally important to not get too bogged down in practicing technique for technique's sake. Remember, our goal as improvisers is to play music, not scales. As always, if you guys did find today's lesson helpful, make sure you give the video a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit that bell for notifications too. If you want access to the PDF for today's lesson, you can grab that along with the whole back catalog for all the videos on the channel for just $10 a month over at my Patreon page, or by just hitting the join button right here on YouTube. A special thanks goes out to Jose Carlos de Souza, Ben John, Ron Maestas, Vladimir Zarate, Gary Dranau, Juan Doming, Alf Collins, and Daniel Alvarenga for being studio fans. I really appreciate the support. An extra special thanks goes out to these studio members for their support as well. Jeff Pack, Besso Bay, Ward Sweat, Manuel, Philip Frankenberger, Brian Silverberg, John Hafner, Nicholas Gagliani, Wilbot, Alain Zeckler, Jingnan Hay, Robert Gannon, Daniel Rogers, Gavin Williams, Moniz Dawood, Brian Roxas, Edward Ellis, Klebs, Zhangpeng Zhu, Joseph Ng, Chris Tondra, Chandler Zachary, Anthony DeChico, Chinedu Ogdobo, Darren Lund, Bertrand Chesnay, Andy, Paul Murin, Martin Vigers, Thomas Kletchafare, S. Bruce 1234, Mark Eslick, Robert Berlin, Robert Cody, Carol, Vaughn Davis, T. Colston, James Seabury, Bill Benfield, Sean Lepore, Apollos Jolivet, Justin Fisher, David Wortman, Aldo Fonseca, Artie Sanchez, Louis Rosen, Stephen Prager, Everton Armstrong, Stephen Schwartz, Max Irwin, David Zuckerbraun, and PH. An extra special thanks to Jazz Luminaire patrons Bill Jacob and Stephen White. Thank you guys all so much for your continued support. I'm David Shore, and thanks again for hanging with me at the studio today. I'll see you guys next time.